You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. This is part 2 of our series about what ICR thinks fossils can really tell us. Last time we were here, Timothy Clarey was saying that we didn't have transitional fossils that we definitely do. Like for the evolution of dinosaurs in general, sauropods and tyrannosaurs, all of which have excellent transitional sequences. He was also imagining that for reasons of not understanding how time works, that the Cambrian was some kind of problem for evolution. He ended off by not really being able to fit pre-Cambrian fossils into his idea of ecological zonation, being the explanation for the ordering of the fossils in the fossil record. Let's see what else he has for us.
It appears when the Cambrian came in, there was also a major erosional surface.
I think he's talking about the Great Unconformity, but I'm not sure. It is interesting to note that he accepts that there are in fact visible signs of erosions in the geologic record of Earth. Many creationists seem to just pretend that there are no erosional features preserved in the rocks.
Called the Great Unconformity, which is pretty much global as well.
I knew it, and yes, it is global. And interestingly, it contains this really neat thing called glacial erratics. Glacial erratics are large stones, or at least large compared to the grains making up the rock they're found in, and which are evidently out of place, having been formed a significant distance away only to be transported to their current location. This transportation was done, as the name implies, by a glacier. If you live in some place that was once under a glacier during a glacial maximum, you're probably familiar with glacial erratics if you've ever dug a hole. For the United States, the country most of my audience is from, that includes all of New England, most of upstate New York, all of Michigan, parts of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and the northern part of any other state that borders Canada, because all of Canada also counts. For my European viewers, it includes all of the British Isles, Scandinavia, and Denmark, as well as parts of Germany, Poland, Kaliningrad, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The glacial erratics in those places, as well as other features of glacial action, such as glacial tills and terminal moraines, are all things we find at the Great Unconformity, meaning that we know what caused it in general. Glaciers. This is connected to the snowball Earth hypothesis, which states that towards the end of the Precambrian, there was a period in which the whole Earth was extremely cold, with little to no free ice year-round. It is hard to imagine how you'd get globally distributed glacial deposits otherwise, on top of an also global unconformity. Interestingly, this is an example of geologists seeing evidence of a global scale event that I'd call a catastrophe and acknowledging what happened. Because geologists aren't out there to try to hide things like global erosional events. They're just out there trying to learn as much as they can about the Earth from the rocks it's made of. And let's remember, these reasons we recognize a glacial feature are the same ones that lead Clarey to accept that there was an ice age in the recent past. So even according to him, they indicate ice erosion. Also, please note, my list of locations with glacial features was not exhaustive. Don't at me.
So there's a lot of erosion as these waves kind of work their way in as they start to flood the land.
Yeah, but you can't just say that this erosion is from ocean waves when it has every hallmark of glacial erosion. You have to actually point to a reason why tsunami is a better explanation, and spoilers, it's not. Just like not all depositions are attributable to floods, neither are all erosion features. Floods do indeed cause erosion, but that doesn't mean you can jump right from erosion to flood. An example from my life might be the concrete steps at the side of the house of my adoptive human parents. They were made of concrete, and had been there since at least the mid-20th century. I have to specify since the house itself had been around for a bit more than 200 years. The stairs were extremely weathered, and the debris from that weathering was removed as it was produced by things like rain. But that house never flooded. It was near the top of a hill, so it probably wouldn't have, even if the houses nearby did. So, do I need to invent the Great House Flood to explain the erosion of my parents' stairs? No, probably not. Just the fact that the majority of the erosion was right under the roof where the rain runs off probably means that the damage was caused by just regular old rain. Similarly, we have every indication that the Great Unconformity is a glacial feature. So unless Clarey has new data contradicting that, we have good reason to say Clarey is wrong about this.
So you deposit all this animals of every type from the oceans, and you're also below that you have a big erosional surface. As the waves were coming in, they were eroding as they went.
We already went over a plethora of reasons that the fossils recorded absolutely cannot be explained by Clarey's ecological zonation model, and now he's just adding what is clearly glacial erosion to his alleged evidence of the flood. Basically, he's compounding multiple reasons we know that the global flood does not explain the Earth's geology, and then just pretending it supports him.
And so a lot of the Precambrian sediments were eroded away at that point as well. But there's still remnants of them, some areas quite extensive.
That's true.
Yep, the great unconformity isn't of the same extent everywhere, and there are some places where some of that Precambrian sediment persists.
Like in Africa, and even here in the United States, there's some locations where we can see Precambrian sediments near some of these rifts, like the mid-continent rift that runs through Lake Superior.
I thought for a second that he was going to say the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which would have been extra stupid. I'm glad he didn't.
And down into Iowa. And you can still see in the flanks of those some of these fossil stromatolites and other Precambrian fossils.
Right.
I think this bears repeating, even though we already went over it. Clarey's idea of ecological zonation means that the farther down in the rocks we go, the lower elevation or deeper underwater fossils should be. In the case of stromatolites, they should be deep-sea organisms according to his model. But as I've already pointed out, stromatolites are photosynthetic bacteria, and they have to live in shallow water so that the sunlight can actually hit them and they can conduct photosynthesis. They simply cannot live in deep-sea environments, and so the very fact that those are our oldest fossils, rather than being exclusively towards the Upper Cambrian, means that they, on their own, falsify Clarey's model. The organisms at the bottom of the fossil record are not deep marine organisms, and Clarey doesn't even seem to want to acknowledge this fact.
But again, it all begins with the flood really kicks into gear in the Cambrian.
Right.
And we see that universally, and that's where you see suddenly everything shows up.
But it doesn't. As I've already said, some animal phyla don't show up at all, and many modern phyla don't show up at the beginning. And even with the members of modern phyla that do show up, they are not in their modern form. Here's a Cambrian echinoderm, Tenno imbricata. Notice how it doesn't look at all like a modern sea star, sea lily, or sea urchin? It's not even radially symmetrical. This is a Cambrian chordate, the same phylum as you or me. Does that look like a fish, or a tiger, or a ceratosaurus, or a human? No, it does not. This is a Cambrian arthropod, Morella. It doesn't look like a member of any modern arthropod group. It's not a crustacean, a myriapod, a picogonid, or an arachnid, or anything else. And so it goes for other phyla too. Modern organisms that are members of the modern phyla that do first show up in the Cambrian are simply not present in the Cambrian, even though in terms of ecological zonation, they should be. The Cambrian seas would present a wonderful feeding opportunity for fish like flounders, or for sharks, or dogfish, or snails, or clams, or squid. But not a single one of any of those groups of animals are found in the Cambrian. I guess they were just living in high elevations? You gotta love those mountain sharks.
And again,
because he drowned.
And the question for the evolutionists is, how did we get from these little ediacaran fossils, strange little things, or algae, all of a sudden to all these animals like trilobites?
Mm-hmm.
Evolution. Like, that's it. It's like asking how a car could possibly drive from Seattle to Boston, and the answer is by driving. What about the Cambrian is supposed to be a problem for evolution? Creationists will say that it's too fast, but never actually back that up with things like using evolutionary biology to see what the maximum pace of things like morphological evolution is, and then showing that it's too fast for the Cambrian. Their objections, like irreducible complexity, were falsified before they were even made, and their complaints about the lack of ancestors in the Precambrian is also partially flatly wrong, and partially just the invalid assumption that the fossil record should be nearly perfect in preservation of ancient life.
You know, where did they come from? And they can't find any. There's no answers.
Except that there is. The whole of Proarticulata is clearly almost bilaterally symmetrical. Namacalithus seems like a potential transition of mollusks, etc. But even then, the ancestors to virtually all modern phyla were completely soft-bodied before the Cambrian, meaning that we really shouldn't expect much from them in the way of fossils, and further, the Precambrian strata have had more time to erode away than any of the other Phanerozoic strata, which is why they're the rarest fossil-bearing strata. Meaning, we have the worst preservation for the diversity of life in such rocks, meaning that we have the smallest chance of finding actual transitions in such rocks. The fossil record has to start somewhere, and the fact that it does start for most taxa at the same point when they likely diverge from related taxa is expected, and not at all evidence of a global flood. What would be evidence of a global flood would be actual flood rock, something that seems surprisingly rare if there was indeed a worldwide flood, which is part of the reason we know there wasn't one.
So the story of evolution that they see marine animals becoming land animals and all these different things is just a story.
Says the guy who takes his beliefs from an actual literary story from the Iron Age that is itself based on earlier Bronze Age myths. Imagine how much projection it takes to complain that the consensus view of science, based on both metaphorical and literal mountains of evidence, is just a story, but that some words in a book from thousands of years ago are the literal true history of the universe. Clarey's about to open up a movie theater.
It doesn't really fit the rock record because we don't see those transitions between them.
Okay, here we go again.
And they have a handful they try to point to once in a while, but they all fall kind of through the cracks because other people dispute them.
He says that, but what's an example? Like, who's disputing the transitional nature of Hypnerpeton, Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, or Euthenopteron? Sure, people point out that they're almost certainly not directly ancestral to any modern organisms, but so what? That's not part of what it takes to be transitional. It's all about the morphology, and the fact that you're far more likely to find a relative of an ancestor than the ancestral species itself means that, yeah, few if any transitional species are known to be ancestral to later species. But again, so what? This just seems like a rehash of the main thesis for Contested Bones by John Sanford and Christopher Roop. Their idea is basically that because some people argue about the phylogenetic placement and morphology of various hominin species, like Ardipithecus ramidus, Australopithecus afarensis, and Homo naledi, that therefore they are somehow no longer transitional and no longer evidence of human evolution. Clarey seems to just be extending that to all organisms. But that basic premise is just a
non sequitur.
I hope I'm wrong about that, but since he hasn't given me a single example of anyone contesting any of the water-to-land transitions for any lineage, I don't know what other conclusion I can come to. If you have any ideas, put them in the comments.
In the evolutionary world, even.
Right.
And so
There's no
unfortunately, we just see the order of burial in the flood.
Wake me up when we get that Cambrian flounder or Devonian water lily. On a side note, why is Flounder from The Little Mermaid called Flounder when he is definitely not a flounder and is instead probably a sergeant major damselfish? And of course, remember that marine fossils are found even in the highest strata, meaning that I guess Clarey is just proposing that ocean life lived on mountains before the flood. The pre-flood world was awash with alpine octopi.
And occasionally we see these big extinctions that they call extinctions. They're not really extinctions, they're just a major shift. Some of those kind of line up even with the mega sequences we talked about in an earlier episode.
Right.
As a reminder, the so-called mega sequences are actually cratonic sequences which record sea transgressions on the North American continent. They are characterized by low-energy marine deposition, not flood deposition, which is the opposite of low energy. Further, who'd have thought that sea transgressions, something highly climate-dependent, might also be linked to mass extinctions, which are also climate-dependent? What a crazy coincidence that I'm sure no scientist can explain apart from a miracle. At some point, maybe Clarey will say something that doesn't point to some aspect of reality that completely disproves his entire worldview. But it doesn't seem to have happened yet.
As the waves kind of come in and go, we see different animals and different plants are buried at different levels as the water progressed higher and higher.
Exactly, that's why animals like Stegosaurus are always buried before the earliest flounders, because Stegosaurus actually lives in shallow seas, and flounders are famous for living on the slopes of mountains or on high plateaus. This is also the case for water lilies, my favorite example. Why were there no aquatic angiosperms in the ponds where Stegosaurus was? Oh, right, because the very concept of ecological zonation is stupid on a level similar to thinking that you can replace gravity with density and buoyancy without noticing that gravity is part of the buoyant force equation.
So those major changes, where you suddenly lose something, you completely inundate that environment, and then you go to the next rocks above it, you see such a major difference.
Right.
They call that an extinction event. And so, like I think we talked about earlier, the dinosaurs all disappeared about the end of the Cretaceous.
Mm-hmm.
There are like 10,000 species of dinosaur alive right now. They're doing just fine.
And it's not coincidence. That's why they call it they changed the name Cretaceous to the next levels above it, because so many fossils disappear there.
Does Clarey not know that the next era is the Paleogene? He could use the older name, Tertiary, but yeah, it's called the KPG because it's the barrier between the Cretaceous, which is spelled with a K in German, and the Paleogene. As for why we're using German initials, well, paleontology has a long history in German, and even today, if you really want to dig into all the paleontology papers, it helps to read some German. I read very little German, as did Darwin. Oh well.
Right.
So it's kind of a circular reasoning to to say that's an extinction event that happened there, because that's how they named those particular rock layers. They were based on the fossil changes.
How is that circular? Like, things are often given different names when they change characteristics. Is it circular reasoning to call something a batter when it's a liquid, but a cake when it's a cooked solid? Like, I do not get what could possibly be circular about this. Naming things isn't even an argument, it's just an arbitrary thing humans do for their own convenience. Further, it's not like Clarey doesn't think something happened that resulted in the KPG. He just differs from the scientific consensus on what it was. So what's wrong with giving the rocks on either side of the event different names? I mean, if Clarey wants to call them both Bob or something, I can't stop him or even say he's wrong. If you can figure out how anything going on here is circular, let me know. I can't figure it out.
Name the fossils from the rocks and the rocks from the fossils.
No, fossils are not named after rocks, nor are rocks generally named after fossils. Are they just mixing up index fossils existing and being used as a quick way in the field to estimate the age of rocks with the name of the fossils and the rocks? It seems like it, but that's extremely dumb. Of course, index fossils are also not circular, because in fact, rocks are dated relatively by stratigraphy, and absolutely by radiometric techniques. But also with things like electron spin resonance, which in no way rely on fossils. So I'm not even sure the naming could be circular reasoning, but the dating could be, but isn't.
Yeah, all the fossil names like Cambrian, Ordovician, all those names came about because of changes in the fossils. Mm-hmm. And that's really just a record of the progressive flood. As you change different environments, you get different animals start showing up.
Ignoring for now that ecological zonation doesn't work at all on any level anywhere in the fossil record, and also doesn't either solve the heat problem or the problem that the vast majority of the sedimentary rock on Earth cannot have been deposited in a flood, different parts of the stratigraphic column are named based on characteristic assemblages of the fossils. Why is that bad? Clarey agrees with the basic fact that such different assemblages exist. A significant characteristic of rock is what fossils it contains. And it doesn't seem like Clarey disagrees. So why would you not give the rocks different names? That's how naming things works. Humans tend to name things based on what things have significant differences to them. Pen and pencil are different words specifically because humans think that the differences between the objects referred to by those words are significant enough to want to consistently differentiate between them. Jurassic and Miocene rocks have very different fossils, and so geologists, who I believe are majority humans, find it convenient to give such rocks different names to reflect this. Why is that a problem? That's how it would be even if Clarey were right.
As the water got deeper and deeper under the continents, you see that progressive change of fossils as well. So it matches what I'm seeing in the sediments. A progressive flood explains the fossil record just as well as it explains the progressive flood we see across the continents.
Okay, but which part of that means that we shouldn't give different names to rock layers based on the fossils in them?
And the two kind of go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And it's all described in the Bible.
Yeah.
No, it's not. Let's just read Genesis 7. This is the Revised Standard Version. The Lord then said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made." And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came on the earth, and Noah and his sons and wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah, and entered the ark, as God commanded Noah. And after the 7 days the flood waters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kind, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains of the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swam over the earth, and all of mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and the animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. That's it. That's the whole description of the flood in Genesis. Nothing about upland whales or about sedimentation, nothing about accelerated nuclear decay. If taken on its own terms without reference to science, the story is that God warns Noah and fam. They get on the boat with the critters. God opens up the windows in the dome over the flat earth, and he opens up the springs in the ocean. Both of these let in the waters of chaos that are mentioned in Genesis 1. The water level rises, then subsides, and the earth is geographically about the same as it ever was, since earlier in Genesis we hear about the Tigris and Euphrates, which on its face implies that these rivers were there before and after the flood, which also matches up with the flood narrative from Sumeria, which has post- and pre-flood kings of the same areas, meaning that the basic narrative of the ancient Near East flood doesn't involve catastrophic changes to the topology of Earth. The only reason Clarey had to add in all this extra stuff that amounts to basically Bible fanfic is because reality simply disagrees with the Bible. So he has to twist both of them to the breaking point in the vain hope that he can wed reality and a faux literal interpretation of the Bible. Clarey and his ilk are doing violence to both science and the Bible.
You read Genesis 7, it's a progressive flood.
I just did read Genesis 7, and nothing in there resembles anything Clarey has been saying in anything but the most general way. I guess if by progressive he means that it took time for the floodwaters to rise and recede, then sure, it was a progressive flood. But that doesn't really mean anything, except that the flood is supposed to have not been instantaneous.
And so we get exactly what we'd expect to see.
Except we don't. And the way we can tell that we don't is that Clarey has to lie about both the rocks and the Bible. If we got exactly what we expected to see, he could at least be honest about both. But he can't. On the other hand, science is based solely on what we can actually see in the real world, without any reference to any books that are supposed to be authorities above reality. Science deals only with what's real in nature. It doesn't always get it right, but at the very least, it has actual evidence from reality that isn't just the description of an ancient book. On the other hand, pseudoscience has some conclusion that must be true, regardless of the reality of the situation. That sounds a whole lot like creationism.
But the evolutionists have to come up with their own story. They want to push God out of the picture.
Right.
Just as a reminder, many paleontologists, geologists, and paleontologists are actually Christians or other varieties of theists. They in no way want to push God out of the picture, but they are also scientists who don't get to simply have dogmatic conclusions about reality that they have to force the data to fit. Science isn't here to push God out of anything, and if you think that it does do that, then I have bad news for your God concept. But I have good news about this channel, and that's that there is a Patreon for it, where you can pledge as little as $1 a month, or if you pledge annually, you can get a 15% discount, and then you'll have the ability to watch my videos like this months early, as well as gain access to my Discord server that's for supporters only.
So they have developed their own story, and they throw in this deep time, millions and billions of years.
Deep time isn't thrown in. It's a conclusion, one that was originally reached by Christians who just wanted to know more about the world. Christians aren't wrong to point out that many branches of science were founded by Christians. But that's a double-edged sword. Sure, they can say that Christianity gets some credit for the fostering of a society in which science can develop. And while I'll point out that it probably had more to do with the Renaissance than with Christianity per se, I won't really contest that Christianity has not at all been a major disaster for science, and that a reasonable argument can be made that it may have helped. But what that means is that you can't really say that all those fields of science that young Earth creationists don't like, which is basically all of them, are the way they are because of some anti-God bias. Deep time is the inescapable conclusion of astronomy and geology. The universe can't be as big as it is without being many billions of years old, and the Earth can't have the rocks it has and the radioactive decay that it has unless it too is billions of years old. That is even the conclusion of the RATE team, which was a group of creationists that got together to try to debunk radiometric dating. They concluded that radiometric dating was consistent, and unless there was exotic physics, aka non-scientific magic that exists for no reason except to shore up the dogmatic beliefs of creationists, radiometric dating should work. So who is it again that's just tossing things in to fix the data so that they can work with their dogmas about God? I think it's the guys literally invoking magic because their ideas are physically impossible.
Which they need. They kind of need both pillars. They need, slow, progressive evolution. And to do that, they need billions and millions of years.
Right.
And so they kind of have to have both those pillars of time and evolution going on.
Clarey is getting the causal relation exactly backwards because he is assuming that scientists operate the way he does, with a conclusion first and then working to fit the data to the conclusion. But that's the opposite of how science actually works. No one woke up one day and decided that deep time and evolution were cool ideas and then went out to try to demonstrate them to be true. Instead, the data precluded a short age of the Earth and species fixity. So scientists came up with ideas that weren't precluded by the data, and then gathered more and more data to winnow down those ideas to just the ones that were well supported. Unfortunately for Clarey, when you start with data and then follow those data, you don't come up with young Earth creationism.
But yet, when you look at the fossils don't show a progressive change. They see sudden changes. A progressive flood, but not progressive evolution.
That's awesome. I love your work. It's great to see, like, this is all such a new thing, right? It's no one's done this before.
It's kind of refreshing in that regard, because it really is showing what the Bible has told us all along.
Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out when you're willing to just accept physical impossibilities and pretend that data don't exist, you can indeed find out that your pet interpretation of your favorite bit of ancient literature is correct. Not sure why that's surprising or a good thing.
We're just filling in some of the details, some of the little bit of wisdom that God's allowing us to see of what happened during the flood year. He gives us major dates, like how the flood begins, day 40, the ark is floating, so you're flooding the land, and then day 150 seems to be the high point, and we can match that up to the geology and the fossils as well.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, when you just make it up, of course you can match your made-up to other made-up. But the problem remains that creationists admittedly do not have a physically possible model of how the flood could even happen. So all of this attempting to match bits of rocks to different parts of Genesis 7 or 8 are meaningless. It's just arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And even on top of this, if we were to ignore the physical impossibilities involved in the deposition, erosion, and heat releases involved in the flood, then we are still faced with the fact that ecological zonation doesn't actually explain the real ordering of fossils that we have. Flood geology is fractally wrong. It's wrong for endless reasons, and it's wrong for such reasons at every scale.
And they all kind of show a similar pattern.
Similar to what? To each other? To Clarey's nonsense?
Tell you what, I am glad that I was not around during the flood. That sounds like a terrifying event.
Good news, Trey. No one had to be around for the flood, because there just was no such event.
Well, yeah, once that door shut,
Yeah.
The 8 people that got on the ark, the rest of the people, their fates were sealed, but it was a slow, painful judgment.
Remember, that makes God a sadistic, genocidal monster. The God of creationists is not a loving, caring God. He's a God who killed babies in a long, slow process of genocide because their parents were bad people. Imagine what you would think of a legal system that tortured the offspring of criminals to death. You'd probably think that that is monstrously unjust, and I'd agree with you. But that's what Clarey and Trey are saying God did in Genesis 7 and 8. But worse, he also killed virtually all the animals too. They're not even associated with the evil people who are the alleged cause of this. And remember, unlike the God portrayed in Genesis, Clarey thinks that God is omnipotent, meaning he could simply wish the people he needed to kill out of existence, without torturing anyone. Or if you're into retributive justice, he could have at least only tortured the people who actually did the evil things while leaving their kids and all the rest of life on Earth alone. Instead, no, he chose to do the most evil thing he possibly could, short of just killing Noah and company too. That's not a God who's the source of all good things and who is righteous and just. That's what a young Earth requires you to believe in. A God who is far more evil than any concept of Satan. If that's what you want, go for it. But I'll let you know that that's not what Christianity demands.
Right.
because initially those first 40 days, it was probably just flooding the shallow seas.
So they knew something was going on.
And then, tremendous amount of rain, which probably never happened before either.
That's one of those claims from creationists that just seems like an unnecessary self-own. The Bible doesn't say it didn't rain, just that there were other mechanisms for watering plants. Rain, or more properly, precipitation in general, is just the flip side of evaporation. Water evaporates and then condenses and falls. What goes up must come down. So what could possibly stop water from evaporating and condensing and falling before the flood? I am not convinced that the goal of any biblical author was to say that the antediluvian world had no rain. But if that was their goal, at least that made sense with their flat earth cosmology, where rain comes from the floodgates of heaven that we hear about in Genesis 7. Rain doesn't come from evaporation of water in the oceans in this view. This would also allow for rain worldwide, which is in fact impossible, given what we know about meteorology. Creationists should really stop suggesting this no pre-flood rain idea. It really is an unforced error.
And then the waters kept coming higher and higher as you made more and more new ocean crust through the plate tectonics.
Which, let's remember, is not anywhere described in the Bible, which seems, if taken at face value, to imply little to no change in the topology of the planet, and which certainly doesn't talk about tsunamis or volcanoes. This is all just made-up nonsense that only exists to try to fix a contradiction between an Iron Age myth and reality. Which, of course, rather misses the point of myth, which isn't to give a sober, literal account of history. Rather, it's to explain the relationship between different aspects of the world and give an explanation for the state of affairs in the world.
That's another story in itself.
Right.
But as the water kept getting higher and higher, of course, the waves kept coming up and up and up. And I believe humans are probably living at the highest elevations in the pre-flood world.
I'm going to use information about the population of the United States not because it's a particularly special country, but because it's easy to find and it's the country I live in. If anything, I think it's probably a very ordinary country in the respect that I'm going to talk about. According to the National Ocean Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States of America, 40% of the American population lives in counties that have oceanic coastlines. For those who don't know, counties are an administrative division in the United States that is smaller than a state but generally larger than a city. That being said, there are some cities which are part of more than one county, so county lines and city limits do not have to line up. Humans love to live near the coast. The ocean is full of all sorts of useful resources. Food in the forms of fish, crustaceans, mollusks, cetaceans, and seaweed. Crafting tools like bones and shells are abundant. The climate is generally milder than in nearby inland areas, and as we can see in traditional farming techniques in Ireland, even if you don't want to eat all the stuff like seaweed that you pull out of the water, you can use it as an excellent fertilizer for farming. Getting away from just the local economic resources, water travel is much more efficient than most options for overland or air travel, which means that water is key in much of the world's trade, and that's been the case for thousands of years. We're going to need some excellent reasons to think that this well-established preference for coastal living among humans would be reversed for humans before the flood.
Makes sense.
No, Trey, it makes no sense at all. Does Trey have a critical thinking bone in his whole body?
So with many of the common mammals, horses and lions and tigers and bears.
Oh my.
Yes.
Oh my.
Well, first, the way Trey says it makes me quite uncomfortable. But also, what about any of those animals says high elevation? One of the most famously tiger-inhabited countries in the world is Indonesia, a place not really full of super tall mountains. That's not to say they don't have mountains, but it's not exactly a high-elevation place like Tibet is. Further, horses do just fine at almost all elevations. Same with bears. As for lions, I guess I don't really know. I know a lot of places they live are relatively high elevation in Africa, and they have been seen on actual mountains. But at this point, I'm not going to check. And even if one of those four examples were actually restricted to high elevation, it doesn't help the overall point, because mammals are not restricted to high elevation.
And you don't find those with dinosaurs.
Well, we should, because based on the paleo environments in which we find dinosaurs, it's the same basic kind of environments we find mammals in. The only reason that I can find for Clarey to think that mammals were high elevation animals before the flood is because he decided that ecological zonation is true, which is actually circular reasoning, unlike naming rock layers different names because they contain different fossils. I guess it's time for Clarey to open up a movie theater because boy is he projecting.
Right. So I think they're at higher elevations, and the plants are different at higher elevations, more of the common flowering plants we see.
Yeah, talk about all those mountain-top mangroves, water lilies, skunk cabbages, halophytes, etc. Oh wait, those are actually low-elevation plants, yet they are only found high up in the fossil record. Oops.
Whereas dinosaurs at a little lower elevation would live in more swamp areas.
Are you kidding me? This asshole already brought up the Plateosaurus in the North Sea that was found in rock that is characteristic of semi-arid regions. I myself am from a North American desert. The whole of the Permian is characterized by dry conditions over most parts of all continents. The famous fighting dinosaurs were found in lithified desert dunes. Were there swamp dinosaurs? Sure, of course there were. But to characterize the whole clade as swamp dwellers, or even primarily as swamp dwellers, is insane. And of course, once again, we're back to circular reasoning. Ecological zonation is the reason for the ordering of the flood, so the dinosaurs are low elevation, and seeing low elevation dinosaurs earlier in the fossil record is evidence of ecological zonation. Literally, the only reason to think that dinosaurs are primarily low elevation is if you think faunal succession is explained by ecological zonation. You can't then use that as evidence of ecological zonation. It's a good thing I swore off hunting humans centuries ago, because this guy is asking for the lawyer treatment.
And they different plants, not more the ferns and the non-flowering plants.
Yeah, there are no low elevation flowering plants like the aforementioned mangroves or water lilies. Yep, those are just fake news. Now, let me all tell you about the people eating cats.
And so the evolutionists, of course, interpret that as plants evolved as well.
Right.
Yeah, plus, genetic evidence and the fact that ecological zonation doesn't work at all for explaining the order of plant fossils. I'm still not over the fact that he said with a straight face that flowering plants are high elevation while living on Earth. Hell, the ICR headquarters is in Dallas, a city that has an elevation of only 550 feet or 168 meters. Is the landscape of Dallas dominated by ferns and cycads? No, it's not. It's chock full of flowering plants like the Mexican plum, pavonia, Texas sage, scarlet sage, the wine cup, prairie verbena, cedar sage, golden groundsel, coral honeysuckle, etc. And those are from a list of native plants that grow in Dallas from lawandlove.com. You know what literally all of those plants have in common? Yeah, they're flowering plants. What could possibly have prevented plants like sedge, sage, plum trees, and honeysuckle from growing before the flood at the same elevations they grow at now? Has Clarey never looked around him at the plants he lives with? I know plant blindness is a thing, but come on, flowers are not exactly subtle on most plants.
But really it's just just an elevation levels where plants are living at different elevations, just like the animals were.
Right.
Except that that's not how those organisms work, and we have been given literally no reason to think that that's how they work, other than that it would be convenient for ecological zonation if they did. Like seriously, look at mangroves. They are a group of several related families of flowering plants, all of which live exclusively in coastal areas around brackish tidal rivers. That's as low elevation as it can get. In fact, some of them live in the intertidal zones, meaning that they sometimes grow at literally zero elevation or even negative elevation. That's all of them. Where are the Devonian mangroves? How did these specialized semi-aquatic halophytes live at high elevation before the flood? They couldn't have. They wouldn't have been able to compete up there. They would have all gone extinct long before any worldwide flood, because none of them could even reach sexual maturity without being strangled by plants that are more efficient in the absence of salts. The whole point of mangroves is that they are salt tolerant, and so they grow where most other plants can't. Put them in an area where anything can grow, and they won't be able to compete. It's like putting a polar bear in the Amazon. It's not going to be able to compete with the jaguars. Mangroves on their own are more than enough to relegate ecological zonation to the trash bin.
And so we don't really find a lot of certain animals with dinosaurs, but we do find squirrels with dinosaurs.
No, we don't. Not one. The only Mesozoic animals that I can find being described as squirrel-like were the genera Xianshu and Shenshu. They're not squirrels. They're not rodents. They're not even mammals. These are late Jurassic arboreal mammaliformes. It's a lot easier to get people to read an article called Mesozoic Squirrel-like Animal than it is to get them to read Mesozoic Arboreal Harameidan Mammaliform. And if you compare their skeletons to those of squirrels, it's very obvious that they're not the same thing. These animals are less squirrel-like than echidnas are, and by a lot. This is something creationists do a lot. They like to take some headline that compares animals from the Mesozoic to some modern mammal to which it is only distantly related, but with which it shares a niche or some other adaptation, and they'll say that they're the same animals. It's just a lie, and the difference between that and the headline writers making up the initial comparison is that the headline writers aren't trying to trick people about the animal, and the body of the article makes it clear that these animals aren't actually the same as the modern animals to which they're being compared. This is how you get creationists saying bullshit like that we have Mesozoic beavers and flamingos. We absolutely do not.
squirrel-like animals, beaver-like animals, things that lived in the swamps. There are mammals.
Oh, the beaver-like animal. He means Castorocata. Again, not even actually a mammal, and the reason it's called beaver-like is because it had a flattish tail. But otherwise, it was actually more like an otter. And it wasn't actually either, because it wasn't a rodent or a carnivoran or even a true mammal. And yeah, we have mammals with dinosaurs because mammals evolved sometime in the middle of the Jurassic. No one has ever said that we don't find mammals with Mesozoic dinosaurs. But they're not modern mammals. So why is it that Castorocata can live in these low-elevation waterways, but actual beavers and otters can't? Why do we so consistently find true mammals only towards the upper parts of the Mesozoic and stem mammals lower than that? Why can't modern mammal kinds be found in the Mesozoic environments that are more or less exactly the same as the ones they thrive in now? Are beavers just way more susceptible to being eaten by dinosaurs than Castorocata? How so?
That lived in these swamps. They're just not horses and camels.
Again, swamps don't characterize even a majority of Mesozoic paleo environments. But what about modern swamp animals? Where are they? We should be finding actual beavers and actual capybaras. Modern swamps have many mammals living in them, like deer, felines, canines, rodents, armadillos, opossums, elephants, hippos, antelope, cattle, etc. Even if we pretend that dinosaurs could chase off the larger such animals, that doesn't seem like it would apply to all animals like small cats and dogs, as well as rodents, opossums, and armadillos. So I invite Dr. Clarey to present me with a Jurassic armadillo or a Jurassic rodent. He won't, though, because no such things exist.
No need for millions of years.
There's none of that.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, as long as physics is something you don't care about, because let's remember, even the creationists had to acknowledge that the Earth has 4.5 or so billions of years of radioactive decay that has occurred on Earth. And they say they need exotic physics to account for this. In other words, the idea of a young Earth violates the known laws of physics. Further, the Earth is full of Cenozoic sedimentary rocks that physics also precludes from being deposited in a flood. So, yeah, you don't need to conclude that the Earth is old in the same way that you don't need to accept gravity. Hey look, another way young Earth creationists are basically the same as flat Earthers.
When you look at the truth of God's Word and you look at the rock record and you look at the fossil record,
I feel like I have done both. In fact, even in this video and the previous one. So that's neat.
and you look at it, they actually match. You see a progressive flood.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Starting in the marine realm, working your way up to, the land animals.
Just, only the ones that should exist based on evolution, but not the ones that should exist based on ecological zonation.
Starting with the swampy areas, but they're also mixing those with marine, as I mentioned, T-Rexes with marine animals.
If only his examples had actually confirmed a wetland depositional environment, instead of being from rocks with the characteristics of semi-arid to arid soils. Man, nothing is coming up Milhouse today for Clarey, is it? But if you want everything to come up Milhouse for you 3 times a week, why not subscribe to this channel? It's free and reversible. And if you hit the bell icon and turn on all notifications, you'll be alerted when I have new content. While you're there, why not also like the video, as it's one of the few ways that YouTube will actually be encouraged to show my videos to people.
And that's universal around the world.
I mean, sure, I'll agree that around the world we see data that completely preclude a global flood.
And then you go higher, you see the mammals. Most of the mammals were deposited as the water was receding, because it went over the top and kind of washed them back down.
I really want Clarey to actually give a detailed model for how he thinks these ecosystems worked. They certainly don't work like anything we're familiar with today. Elevation certainly affects ecosystems, but it's not like ecosystems have sharp demarcations like they're stepped terrain or something. Look, this is how Clarey thinks the pre-flood world was. A bunch of carefully maintained terraces with sheer rock walls between them so that there's no touching. In reality, landscapes are smooth and transitions between ecosystems are too. I would really love to know if this is what Clarey is advocating for, because it's the only way it seems to make sense. Except that unlike in my terrace version, in his there are more terraces, and some of them are impossibly oceans.
So there's probably a lot of mammal fossils even offshore, just like that dinosaur I mentioned earlier as well.
Oh, you mean the dinosaur we know lived in an arid environment? And we know that from the paleosols preserved in the Lunda Formation. Soil takes years to build up. The Lunda Formation cannot have been formed in a flood because soils with the characteristics of those that form in arid environments, and that take many years to form, can't form under a flood in about a year or so. And there are multiple paleosols in the Lunda Formation, not just one. So this area existed above water and in low moisture conditions for at least decades, if not centuries. It's physically impossible for this to be a flood deposit.
But to me, the evolutionary community has not adequately explained why these animals, not just in the Cambrian, but throughout the rock record, everything shows up fully formed, ready to go.
Because no one has any clue what Clarey would call not fully formed. I'd argue that Tiktaalik isn't a fully formed tetrapod, and that Ambulocetus is a not quite fully formed whale, and that Australopithecus is a not fully formed human. But on the other hand, they're fully formed species well adapted to their niche and environment. Does he want organisms that look like a blob of melting wax? Unless Clarey wants to clarify what he means, this isn't even an argument.
Yeah. Wow.
A valuable contribution from Trey. I have more than once pointed out that Trey isn't very good at this, and whoever is directing and editing this isn't helping. To the production staff over at ICR, if they ever see this, help your boy Trey. Let him take multiple takes. Maybe cut out when he just kind of grunts under his breath like this. This is a video podcast. I don't need Trey's back channeling because I'm not the one in the conversation and looking for clues that he's still paying attention. Y'all have lighting and even shot composition down reasonably well. Just get better at directing and editing. That's all I ask. And yeah, I'm not perfect, far from it. But I'm also a one dinosaur show. No one is helping me edit, light, direct, or perform. It's just me. Y'all have way more money than I do and a bigger staff. Make the most of it.
At each level, as you go along, there's really no transitions between them. You just go from one environment to the next. As you bury them, there's these sudden changes.
Well, first, that's not really true. There are indeed formations where you can trace changes in depositional environment that change smoothly both horizontally and vertically. But also, it's true that sometimes there's an abrupt change from one to the other. That's because erosion happened. Erosion removes smooth transitions between depositional environments, and Clarey knows this, because he has already talked about it when he was going on about the Great Unconformity, which is a sharp transition. And it not only means a different set of organisms on either side of the unconformity, but usually also a different kind of rock, which is hard to explain via a flood, which should be pretty uniform in terms of mode of deposition, even if not always in what kind of sediment is being deposited.
They use those to come up with their names, and say this is the Cambrian, this is the Ordovician, this is the Silurian, etc. But they still can't explain why did they change.
Yeah.
Extinction and evolution. That's it. Sometimes loss of extinction happens at once, like at the end of the Permian, because continent-scale volcanism released way too much toxic gas in the air and changed the climate, poisoned the land and the sea, and like 90% of organisms died. We have the actual volcanic rock and chemical signatures of the eruption in the rocks elsewhere, and it directly corresponds to the vast reduction in biodiversity we see at the start of the Triassic. And it also explains why the Triassic looks like a bunch of adaptive radiations of mostly reptile clades. Because it was. As the Earth recovered, many niches that had previously been filled by stem mammals were open, and the reptiles were the first to occupy them, which is why the Jurassic, Triassic, and Cretaceous are sometimes called the Age of Reptiles. At the end of the Cretaceous, there was another mass extinction that was caused by an asteroid impact, for which we have a crater, ejecta, and a global iridium layer as evidence, as well as, again, increased volcanic activity. As a result, virtually all of the megafauna on Earth died off, and this time, the synapsids in the form of crown mammals had their turn after a brief experiment in the Paleogene with whale-sized caimans, hoofed land crocodiles, and predatory birds the size of a modern horse. Clarey is free to argue against these explanations, but here he seems to be just pretending that they don't exist. They absolutely do, and implying that they don't is just dishonest. Of course, arguing against them would actually require him to do work at finding areas where the scientific consensus has not accounted for data, or has interpreted data wrong, or for him to find new data that contradict the consensus. But all that sounds like a whole lot of doing actual science, and Clarey is a pseudoscientist. He doesn't have time for all that. He's got to keep lying for Jesus.
They don't
The
have the
progressive
answer.
flood makes more sense.
Just as long as you don't think about it, like, at all.
Absolutely. I mean, simplest solution, right?
It's the order of burial. That's all
But-
it is.
Yeah, the simplest scenario is a physically impossible flood of an unaccountably terraced planet with physically impossible highland oceans.
But when you want to put God out of the picture, it makes more sense almost to craft a strange false narrative, right?
But the narrative wasn't crafted in an effort to encourage atheism. It's just that science looks for repeatable, testable, and falsifiable mechanisms, and God just isn't one of those. God can't be depended on to do miracles on command, real or not, and so he's not really amenable to scientific testing. And since he's supposed to be omnipotent, he's not falsifiable either. It turns out when you look for explanations that are scientific for things like the rocks on Earth, you get deep time. It's so inescapable that even the rape team admitted it. The scientific explanation is the scientific explanation precisely because it fits the data. You can call that a story if you want, but it's the story that actually explains and is compatible with reality as far as we can tell. I'm sure some aspects of it are in fact wrong, but we'll fix those as we get better data. Because fundamentally, science is just about getting less wrong about the world. Creationism is about staying as wrong about the world as you were at first, and saying that any attempt to make you less wrong is actually a satanic plot to make you lose your eternal salvation.
And unfortunately, that's become ingrained in our world today because they've been teaching this for 160 years.
Yeah.
All that is Clarey telling on himself as to how out of date his ideas are. Being opposed to 160 years of scientific advancement is a bad thing. It means we've known you're wrong for at least that long. That should be deeply embarrassing to anyone. 160 years ago, we didn't know that the continents moved. Slavery was still legal in the United States, and we hadn't even discovered that radioactivity even existed. That's the level that creationists would drag the rest of humanity to if they could.
And it's become science.
Yes, data-driven evidence-based explanations for physical phenomena tend to become science when they fail to be falsified for long enough. Weird, right?
Well,
every kid who even watches TV, for sure. It's just, it's even raised in a Christian home. Like, I grew up kind of thinking some things that were incorrect, and my parents didn't even hold those views. It just kind of seeped in from media. And
yeah, media just assumes science is basically right. This is just like a flat earther complaining that all the Hollywood movies show the earth as a globe. It's not to trick you. It's because people who aren't actually conspiracy theorist pseudoscientist fans expect the world to be portrayed more or less accurately in their media unless there's a damn good reason not to, such as that the media is actually a fantasy story. If creationists want media that assumes that they're right, they're either going to have to make it themselves or actually make their case in the scientific literature and change the consensus. Of course, the second isn't going to happen, because a young Earth is just as plausible as a flat Earth, so I hope the young Earth creationists enjoy watching their own crappy Christian movies.
Yeah, it seems like everybody believes an asteroid killed the dinosaurs.
I think the crater has something to do with that.
A lot of Christians don't think that dinosaurs were on the ark.
Right.
Well, good, because there is no ark as described in Genesis. It's not a real thing that happened. Christians not believing that is Christians not believing a very obviously ahistorical story.
But they really were. God didn't exclude any animals. He brought all kinds, and the Bible doesn't refer to dinosaurs because the word wasn't invented until after the
1800s, right?
Yeah, in 1611, you had the King James Version, there's no dinosaurs.
Right.
So there are actually a lot of dinosaurs in the Bible, but they are mentioned explicitly in Genesis 7. It's just that they're all birds. But the reason that the word dinosaur isn't in the Bible isn't because the word wasn't invented yet. The Bible didn't start with King James, and now we're stuck with only the words that were in the English language at the time of the early 17th century. Any modern translation of the Bible could include the word dinosaur if the Hebrew or Greek of the Bible were best translated as such. The reason no modern Bible has the word dinosaur in it is the same reason it doesn't have the word penguin in it. Nowhere in the Bible is the word dinosaur a reasonable translation for anything, because apart from birds, the Bible doesn't discuss dinosaurs for the same reason it doesn't discuss penguins. The authors didn't even know they had ever existed.
So they couldn't put the word in there, but I think the Bible does talk about dinosaurs in the book of Job.
For sure.
No, it absolutely doesn't. But hey, rather than get into it here, there's a link to a discussion I had with Vishanti and Dr. Kip Davis, a PhD Old Testament scholar, about this exact topic. To summarize, we know that Behemoth, which is what they're talking about, is a singular gigantic masculine bull monster that symbolized the danger and chaos of the wilderness, and Leviathan is a multi-headed snake-like dragon that is feminine and symbolizes the danger and chaos of the seas. Neither are real animals that have ever existed, and neither of them are dinosaurs or any other extinct organism.
It mentions, dragons here and there. Those were probably dinosaurs after the flood.
No, they weren't. The words sometimes translated as dragon in English from the Bible are the Hebrew words tanin and the Greek drakon, the later of which is indeed where we get the word dragon in English. But in Hebrew, tanin is a word for a serpent-like sea monster and is used to refer to Leviathan. Also, the word tan in Hebrew means jackal, and the plural form of that word, tanim, is sometimes replaced with the similar tanin, and so we get odd situations like Christians saying that dragons are mentioned in Lamentations 4, when in fact they're jackals. And we can tell because unlike reptilian sea monsters, they're described as howling and suckling their pups. In the case of the Greek word drakon, that word literally just means snake, Or perhaps serpent, as it's not the most common word for snake, but rather it's more a word that is used in more poetic or formal literary contexts. Neither of these words is reasonably translated as dinosaur, and that's why modern translations don't translate them that way. Even the other ones that are designed to cater to evangelicals, like the New International Version or the English Standard Version.
And so there's evidence out there, a lot of carvings and paintings and writings even about dinosaurs after the flood.
No, there aren't. No creationist has ever actually produced any cultural artifact depicting dinosaurs in a plausible, let alone incontrovertible way. It's always fantastical creatures that look like nothing that has ever existed, or depictions of modern animals that are odd because the artist never actually saw one in real life. I have gone through every example I could find of creationists saying that some work of literature or art depicts dinosaurs, and none of them actually check out.
Dinosaurs were on the ark. They got off the ark, but again, they went extinct like many animals did since the ark landed.
So God is just super incompetent. The point of the ark, according to Genesis 7, is to keep the humans and the various kinds of animals alive through the flood so that they would not die out. Every single extinction after the time is a direct failure of the ark and therefore of God. At least if we take Genesis 7 and 8 the way that Clarey wants us to. Why does Clarey's God suck so much? Not only is he a genocidal maniac, but he is also utterly incompetent on a level that would make even an idiot like Elon Musk blush.
About 4,500 years ago, so that there's been a lot of time. And you don't make fossils today.
Right.
That's just flatly false. The very existence of subfossils, which are found in multiple parts of the world, indicate that fossils are forming today. Left undisturbed, subfossils become fossils.
Because fossils need to be buried fast, and you need to bury them deep.
Both fast and deep are relative. They have to be buried faster than they decay, and deep enough to avoid being dug up by scavengers. But there are situations where that's not very fast or deep. For example, some of the best fossils come from anoxic lagoons, where there are almost no scavengers and the rate of decay is very slow because no aerobic organisms can exist. But also, things like sediment slumps can bury organisms much faster than the normal deposition rate would suggest. That's probably what happened in most cases of large organisms found in limestone. And it's also what probably happened in the famous fighting dinosaurs. The Protoceratops and the Velociraptor were fighting, and they were probably caught in a dune collapse. These things happen even today. They certainly happened in the past.
And even many of the evolutionary community are starting to admit that now. That you can't just have something die
And fall
and
into
lays
the
there
water.
for 6 months or a year or so, and then
get eaten.
slowly gets buried. Yeah, it gets eaten.
Yeah.
And then it rots away.
What's this admit nonsense? That's long been just a part of standard taphonomy, or the study of how fossils form.
And so you don't have this survival that they kind of implied.
And so you don't have this survival that the kind of implied. What the actual does that even mean?
So they're now admitting that, okay, there were these little catastrophes.
Yeah, because there's evidence of some catastrophes throughout the history of the Earth. This is called actualism, which means you neither reject catastrophes nor blame them for everything. But if you want to propose a catastrophic cause for what you're seeing in the rocks of the Earth, you need to actually show how that's not just physically possible, but the best explanation. But if the rock in question couldn't have been produced in a catastrophic way, like limestone, or the catastrophe proposed breaks the laws of physics, like Clarey's flood, then it has to be rejected. I know, it's so mean of science to not simply admit unscientific possibilities, is it?
Major floods, but they still don't believe in a global
The
flood.
one big one.
To me, the global flood still solves all their problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah, at the cost of literally being impossible, meaning that it solves all their problems the same way that just saying that invisible pink unicorns made all the rocks as they were in the year 1923, and then flew away to Pluto solves all the problems. One thing you don't need magic to explain is how awesome my channel memberships are. You can get to turn your name green in live chats, get a cool badge based on how long you've been a member, as well as monthly membership chats that are like super chats, but you don't have to pay extra for them. You'll also be granted early access to my scripted videos and access to my super secret Discord server that's just for members and patrons. There's a join button right below this video, so give it a look and join if you can afford to.
Absolutely. It makes the most sense. I'm with you.
As a general rule, breaking the laws of physics makes the least sense. That's why the episode Parallax of Star Trek Voyager makes the most sense of all Star Trek episodes, because Janeway and Torres find a crack in the event horizon of a black hole and manage to escape through it. That makes all the sense.
That begs the question then, what about the humans? We have all these other fossils, and I know that we have, bits and pieces of human fossils, but why aren't there more?
And none of the human fossils are from rocks that are generally agreed by young Earth creationists to be flood rocks.
Well, it's hard to argue without having data. You know, there are very few human fossils, but there's a few in the uppermost rock layers.
Actually, humans and their closest relatives, the other hominins, have one of the best and most complete fossil records out there. We have hundreds of specimens from dozens of species. It's almost absurd how good the fossil record of humanity is, to at least about 5 million years ago. Humans might be one of the most well-documented fossil sequences we have.
And I think part of the problem is that humans were probably living at the highest levels, and they were flooded last, like the lions and tigers and the bears. They're living up in those areas.
Hey, fun fact, we have a lot of fossil bears and panthers. So I'm not sure this is where he wants to go with this. But also the world isn't a terraced land full of sheer cliff walls, so this doesn't make a lick of sense.
And just like you don't find humans and dinosaurs mixed, you know, there's a possibility we could, and some people say that maybe there's some footprints here and there, but...
Hey, Creation Ministries International has that claim on their list of arguments creationists shouldn't use.
There hasn't been any really confirmed cases of mixing of dinosaurs and humans.
That's true.
But I think they were living at higher levels, so we wouldn't expect them to be mixed in there necessarily.
This from the man who complains about just so stories from real scientists. Like the only reason anyone would ever think that humans lived at high altitudes preferentially is that they needed it to be true. Humans actually preferentially live at low elevation here in reality.
And if you're buried last, one of the last things to get buried, if you're not buried deep enough, you're not going to become a fossil.
Gotcha.
And a lot of the humans might have also washed offshore. And
Just floated in the
as the
water.
water was receding, and so many of the major, they might be buried offshore.
Isn't everything washed offshore in this model? Does he just mean off of the modern shores? Why would the last things be more likely to be washed off of modern shores? If they're starting at the highest elevations, that also usually corresponds to being fairly far inland, since the shores are always the lowest elevation part of any landmass. Wouldn't that make them less likely to be washed offshore? How does Clarey's reasoning work?
We'll never find them probably unless we drill an oil well and get lucky, like they did with that
dinosaur bone.
Plesiosaurus. Yeah.
Yeah, any day now, a oil rig is going to pull up a goddamn human fossil. All the creationists watching, I encourage you to start holding your breath in anticipation. Also, why does he keep bringing up the dinosaur that absolutely destroys his entire view of geology? It's really weird.
But for the most part, I think the humans just weren't buried deep enough
Gotcha.
to become a fossil. You got to be buried fast and deep.
Weird, given how astoundingly complete the human fossil record is.
And deep can vary depending on the conditions, but generally they probably weren't buried deep enough.
Wait, he knows that? That deep and fast are relative terms? So, why does he object to non-catastrophic formation of fossils? That's all you need to see how that works. Like, how do I come away from him saying that he understands this and not come to the conclusion that he's being deeply dishonest? Creationists who might watch this, help me out. Explain how I can take Clarey as a good faith actor.
And there's been erosion in the last 4,500 years.
That's true.
And for a longer time than that.
So if they were buried in the upper layers, they might have eroded away. There was an ice age that came on after the flood.
Except the younger layers of Earth are demonstrably less eroded, and this is one of the most basic facts of geology. Younger layers are always more extensive and less eroded. I guess it's just opposite day at ICR. Of course, that's the opposite of what the flood model would predict. So I guess just plain old erosion is another way to note the flood geology is utter horseshit.
That might have scoured away some of the rocks at the highest levels as well. And so we might have had more fossils of humans if it wasn't for the 4,500 years of erosion on the uppermost layers,
Right.
where they might have been buried or laid at the surface even then. So if you're not buried fast and deep, and they were probably buried fast, but they might not have been buried deep enough
Gotcha.
or are offshore.
Well, I've already addressed all that nonsense, but is it just me, or did he suddenly get all echoey? What is with this production? It's like in some ways it's pretty high value for a random pseudoscience interview, but then sometimes it just falls apart.
But again, it's hard to argue exactly what happened to the humans.
Why? Just say something impossible happened. It's what creationists do for most things that can't work that they believe. Like at this point, why not just say it's miracles all the way down? It's not like they're going to find any kind of plausible mechanisms for any of this nonsense.
And then we assume they were probably last.
Yeah.
For no other reason than that the lack of human fossils otherwise wouldn't make much sense. I never want to hear another creationist even accuse scientists of telling just so stories again.
And
'Cause they could get to the high
without
ground.
data, it's a little more speculative.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That's a very good answer. Thank you.
What would be a bad answer for Trey? Of course, the real answer is anything that doesn't confirm his bias.
Well, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, that has been one of the dumbest things I've ever encountered. At this rate, I feel like I should watch some Eric Dubé to feel smarter.
Well, just that, again, keep in mind that
Oh, right, he means from Clarey. My bad.
today, fossils aren't forming.
Yeah.
Boy, was I wrong.
Only the conditions of the flood provide the real, I guess they're...
Mechanism.
The real mechanism, the real mechanism and the opportunity for millions and billions of fossils to form, and that's what we see. That's what gives us the fossil record.
Yeah.
Yes, but only if we're willing to ignore all logic, evidence, and physics.
But it's mixed in the rock record. They're kind of they go hand in hand.
Well, the fossils are a part of the rock, so, yes?
Brother and sister, there you go.
And they all show progressive flood. They all can be best explained by a progressive global flood.
Yeah, that's why so much of the rocks can't be explained by a flood. Like all of the limestone, most of the shale, most of the sandstone, most of the mudstone, and any stone with fossil footprints. Any rocks that preserve paleosols, etc.
As described in the Bible.
Awesome.
Except that, as we've seen, none of that is in the Bible.
Which was a judgment.
It was, yes.
And
that's why they all died, right? That's the reason.
That's right. But God has given us salvation through Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, yes, the preaching part. Because ultimately, that's what they care about. That people believe in Jesus. And hey, I don't care. Have as much faith as you want in Jesus. But that faith isn't an excuse to lie about science.
So we don't have to worry about the coming judgment.
Absolutely.
If there is a coming judgment, and God is in any way just, then I can't imagine that lying about science will be seen as doing a good thing, and I imagine that Clarey will regret his life at that time. Of course, whether or not there is a judgment, that's the end of this video. Next time we're going to jump into a new video with Brian Thomas and a different host, Ivana. That video will focus on transitional fossils in particular, so get ready for some yodeling. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit like and let me know what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike, and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Before you go, I'd like to just take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Philrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Ellerhan Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Vollus, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, and Dr. Tapioca Weasel. It's because of my channel members and patrons that I'm able to do this show as I am now with 3 videos a week. Without them, I would be reduced to maybe 1 a week, or maybe even 1 every other week. So, if you like this channel and you'd like to support, there's a link to the Patreon in the description, and a join button below this video. All channel members and patrons get early access to videos, often many months in advance, as well as access to my super secret Discord server that's just for supporters and is a great way to contact me. Thanks for watching.